play it, if only to see what one of our guests is wearing, because it's quite spectacular. I am referring to Albie Amankona, who is from Conservatives Against Racism. James Heappey is the Conservative MP for Wells, Minister of State for the Armed Forces and Veterans. Rachel Johnson is, well, you know who she is. She presents on Sundays between 7 and 10 on LBC and has a wonderful podcast called Difficult Women, and she's about to prove why she's called the podcast that in this hour, no doubt. Thank you all very much for joining us. We'll come to your first question in just a few moments' time.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first caller. It's Keith, who's a new caller in Beckenham. Hello, Keith.
Hello there. So my question is, instead of the 45p tax cut that Kwasi did, if he'd have made a tax cut, say, for instance, to raise the 40p tax from 52,000 to maybe 60,000 or 70,000 and aimed it more at Middle England instead of the extra wealthy over 150,000 and put more money for those tax cuts in Middle England's pockets, do you think that would have been more palatable? And also, do you also think that maybe the pound may not have dipped quite so much if he'd have made that kind of tax cut?
James Heappey.
Yes, and not sure.
Is that it?
Well, I mean, I think so. I think that that we've learnt something pretty important, that you can unveil tens of billions of pounds worth of intervention, that 95% of which helps normal families across the country with the cost of living. But if you do something that catches the eye, becomes totemic, that is helping the wrong part of the earning spectrum, then you very quickly lose the public support, and you have to take a decision. The one blessing today was the decision was made quickly, and therefore we can get on with talking about everything else. But I think that the suggestion that your caller made, that something that was a bit more targeted around Middle England probably would have gone down better. And I think, I don't mean to be glib about the interest rate thing, but I think it's been an oversimplification in the way that people have sought to explain what drove the rise in interest last week. I don't think it was solely the consequence of the mini budget. I think there were plenty of other things going on in the global economy that would have caused a rate rise.
The fear is what's happened over the past week will exacerbate any future rises and make them bigger than they would have been otherwise.
Well, I mean, that remains to be seen. But it would be churlish to come on here and say it had nothing to do with it. But equally, I just think it's important to say it wasn't solely responsible either.
Rachel.
Well, I think you can debate till the cows come home which segments of the population and the country were most in need of tax cuts, but this just was not the time to deliver a budget under the cloak of a fiscal event that was supposed to be an energy package. That's why it all went south, including the pound. And that's why I don't think that we should be talking about tax cuts now, because obviously it unnerves the market so much, because we're in an inflationary spiral in an environment. We don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to go. There's no guarantee that mortgage rates, interest rates and energy prices are going to come down anytime soon. So it just wasn't the moment to even discuss tax cuts.
There is an argument, though, that if tax cuts are targeted and funded properly...
Yes, but they weren't funded.
They weren't.
There was nothing about how they were going to be paid for.
I mean, it is a correct argument to say that tax cuts can stimulate economic growth. So from that point of view, you could understand if they wanted to have tax cuts. And there was, let's not forget, there was the 1p cut in income tax across the board. But if they had targeted tax cuts at people who would actually go out and then spend the money, rather than rich people who, if they are going to get tax cuts, they might squirrel the money away or they might invest it in something, who knows, but they're less likely to spend it in the way that normal consumers would. So there is an argument for tax cuts to stimulate growth, surely.
Well, not if the announcement of those tax cuts is so badly messaged that it causes a run on the pound and a rise in your mortgage rates. It's going to completely wipe out any benefit from the 1p in your tax in your tax burden that you'll be paying.
But there is still
it was a complete own goal as far as I could see.
I don't think I would dispute for a second that the 45p thing was turned out to be pretty monumentous own goal. But there is something, if 3 weeks ago, the conversation that you would have been having with me is about what are you going to do meaningfully to help people with the cost of living this winter. The energy intervention is huge. potentially a reduction of £3,500 a year for the average household, the reversal of the national insurance rise, the reduction in the basic rate of income tax. I mean, this is the vast majority of the money that the Chancellor released in his package is going to help the average family. It's just been lost in the noise.
But again, he didn't say how he was going to pay for that vast package to help people pay for their energy bills, did he? So it was an unfunded tax cuts on top of an unfunded, well, which is unfunded, isn't it? Because you have to pay for borrowing in the end through raising taxes.
Look, I mean, of course, borrowing is just deferred taxation, but the reality is that so urgent was the need for an intervention that I think it was justified to borrow in order to do it.
Right, let's bring Albie in.
I think we've got to start looking forwards and learn from the errors that were made last week, and there were some pretty fundamental errors that were made. I think it's pretty unbelievable that we ended up in a situation where the Prime Minister announced an energy support scheme, essentially partially paying people's energy bills for up to 2 years, announced that she was going to give more people their money back in terms of tax cuts, and it ended up being really unpopular because of this 45p to 40p additional rate abolishment. We should be getting political capital from policies like these, and I think Penny Mordaunt said it best at her event last night with I won't swear, with the Conservatives in Communications.
Penny Mordaunt said it best.
Who's
going to tweet that out?
She said our policies are good, but our comms are. And I won't say the word.
SH1T, we can say
exactly.
That.
And I think our comms need to get better. So that was my big concern with Liz Truss, to be honest, from the beginning, is that as a communicator, she was not as strong as some of the other candidates that were in the leadership race. She really needs to brush up and deliver a speech later on this week, which is going to reassure the membership, but also reassure the markets and the rest of the country.
I love this tweet from New One, who says, Iain Dale going out to bat for the government on his LBC show again. Weren't you listening in the last hour, New One? I was just explaining how targeted tax cuts can stimulate economic growth, but believe me, I think the whole last 10 days has been an absolute, as I call it, a truster shambles, because it was eminently predictable what would happen after that mini budget. And if I can understand it, as someone who knows very, very little about economics, because my first reaction was, this will spook the markets. I'm thinking, well, if I can understand that, why didn't the people in Number 10 understand it?
Well, and also, why did Kwasi apparently go to this donors cocktail champagne reception and say, more to come, and be encouraged to talk? We don't know. We weren't there at Andrew Law's house on the day on September the 23rd. But the idea that it was a good idea to further flag more tax cuts when the pound was already on the way down seems to me not great politics or great economics.
Right, Keith, thank you for your question. Let's bring in another question from Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Ian and panel. Yes, should there be a general election like Nadine Dorries is calling for?
Oh, God, really?
Nadine Dorries has been tweeting today. I did try and persuade her to come on my programme, but she thought that was not maybe a good idea. And for somebody who was a real Truss supporter, how quickly the worm can turn. And she's now become a rather vocal opponent of Liz Truss, and says, well, if she's going to scrap all of these policies that were the policies of the government that she was a member of, then there should be a general election. Albie?
I think it's an important reminder, for this government that the Conservatives were elected in 2019 on a manifesto of Rachel's brother, of course, which is very different, I think, to what we are seeing today. And I think the government needs to remember that we do need to be, if we want to hold that electoral coalition at the next general election, which I do not think should be soon, we do need to be making sure that we are delivering on things like levelling up. I do not think those red wall seats in the north would have accepted a situation where we were cutting the top band of income tax from 45% to 40%, and then pursuing a programme of austerity. We don't know whether or not that's going to happen, but there are certainly rumours of that coming down the line. And if that were the case, that would have been completely different to what people voted for in 2019. So I think this government needs to remember what the people actually voted for in 2019 and focus on delivering it without promising too much extra.
James, I imagine your answer is going to be no.
Yeah, I think for two reasons. Firstly, that the government's mandate comes from Parliament, effectively. We're a parliamentary democracy, and we vote in general elections, and thereafter the executive emerges from the Parliament. And secondly, I think that the public are probably quite keen that there's a bit of stable government that gets on with delivering. Now, that's to say that today rightly gets eyes raised from all of those on the panel. But today aside, what matters is that people get on with now delivering, A, against some relief against the cost of living, B, I genuinely don't think we should apologise for the growth agenda. I think that doing something bold economically is no bad thing and probably long overdue. But this has been an odd parliament. The first 2 years were largely consumed by a response to COVID. The next year, war in Ukraine and everything that happened with Boris and the change of leader. And so we find ourselves now with 2 years of the parliament to run or under. And there's a lot of work to do to deliver for people who have put their trust in us as a government.
Rachel?
Well, I think James Heappey had to say what he just said, but nobody voted for what was announced on September the 23rd. And those who returned the Tories to an 80-seat majority in 2019 voted for a manifesto of levelling up, no return to austerity, infrastructure, all the things that I don't think are part of the Liz Truss plan anyway, especially when it comes to the environment. And we have seen environmental groups from the RSPB, I know the NFU is on board because the wholesale binning off of environmental protections and EU regulations is actually going to help big farmers and big agriculture because they're returning
to a... We might come on to that a bit later when Minette's here.
Oh, is Minette here?
Yes.
Well, it returns to, you get paid by how big your farm is rather than what you're doing in order to protect the environment and renew the soil.
Did you vote
so what I'm
Conservative
saying
in
is,
2019?
I don't think that this Tory iteration of the Tory government does have a mandate for this growth agenda.
Did you vote Conservative in 2019?
I can't actually remember. I really
come off.
genuinely
Your
can't
brother
remember.
was running to be Prime Minister.
Surely you
must
must
remember.
have done.
And I can see Minette over there. So, I know Minette has welcomed the
No, come on. I'm not letting you off with that.
Well,
you
I
can't say that you
honestly
don't
can't
remember who you voted for.
Well, don't forget that I'm in Kensington and Chelsea. It's a very highly marginal seat. I think it's a Tory majority of 150.
What I'm asking is, was your vote one of those?
I think it's probably that my time of life is that the blessed sponge of amnesia has wiped clean the memory bank of that event. I do remember what happened though, which was,
we all remember that.
Of course, you can't forget that. And Liz Truss is riding on the coattails of that success. And I think when you ask about a general election, the problem is that she can't call a general election because she won't find her own mandate through the plebiscite. So she's just got to plough on, get her head down, do as much as she can until the next general election in, I think, 2025. It's going to be as late as possible, January, I say.
Rachel, are you sure that the growth plan isn't levelling up? I mean, there are page upon page upon page of infrastructure projects in there that are long overdue and are focused on the regions.
Okay, you're right in calling that out. I haven't actually read the 40-page growth plan yet.
I think the investment zones are a fantastic idea for putting really great development and investment areas into areas where they are wanted, and I think could be really catalytic. I think that the focus on tax cutting, reducing corporation tax, making the UK a more attractive place to invest has all of the potential to really catalyse levelling up. So I don't accept that this is a massive break from where we were in terms of the macro ambition of government. Fiscally, maybe it's slightly different, but the overriding mission remains absolutely the same, which is to level up for people in all parts of the UK.
Well, in that case, if we're going to get any investment, obviously foreign direct investment, what we need to see is a stable fiscal environment. And the Tories reclaim their now lost reputation for fiscal competence.
Right, we will continue with more of your questions in a moment with Albie Amankona, James Heappey and Rachel Johnson. 0345 6060 973. At 8:30 we're going to be joined by Minette Batters, the President of the National Farmers Union as well. You can text your questions to 84850 and watch us on Global Player. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LB. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:20. We're live from Birmingham. Albie Amankona is with us. Just explain what you're wearing, Albie, for those watching.
So I am wearing my grandfather's dashiki, and the reason for that, I thought, well, if this was the year I was going to wear it, it would be this year, because of course we've got a Ghanaian Chancellor, and this was made in Ghana. I'm also going to be attending, after I finish with you, Ian, the launch of the 2022 group, which is a new group.
I was supposed to be coming to, but for obvious reasons.
You can't. But essentially, it is a new group of black conservatives formed in 2022 in the style of the 1922 committee, and what the group aims to do is increase the participation of black people in conservative politics, in elected positions and across the party, and also come up with policy ideas for both the domestic and international agenda.
Fantastic. James Heappey is with us, Minister of State for the Armed Forces and Veterans in the Ministry of Defence. Now, that, I think, must be one of the best Minister of State jobs in government.
It is.
You were in the Ministry of Defence before, weren't you? So you've been there.
Yeah. So I was Minister for Defence Procurement for about 3 months after the 2019 general election, and I've been Minister for the Armed Forces ever since, which has been pretty extraordinary, actually. Sort of straight into all of the troop involvement in the response to COVID, and then the vaccine rollout, then Afghanistan last summer, and then Ukraine, and actually, and sort of alongside all of that, there's this kind of the business as usual of sort of being around the world, reacting to other areas where the UK interest isn't threatened, and that's meant actually a couple of trips to Ghana, because the Sahel is increasingly important, I think, to security in Europe, and the Russian mercenary group Wagner is sniffing around a lot in Mali, and potentially after the coup this week in Burkina Faso. And so we have a real shared purpose with the Ghanaians in trying to sort of get behind this thing called the Accra Initiative, which is a sort of West Africa-wide solution to the Sahel, which is, having learnt all the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan and the French in Mali, the sort of West Africans want to do it themselves, but with a bit of support from their friends in Europe and America, and that's what we're seeking to do. So, great job.
And you see, this is what you get when you do stay in the same department for some time, because I think there are too many ministers now who get reshuffled after a year, 18 months, and you really only got into the job at that point, and you've had Veterans Affairs added to your responsibilities, which means you attend Cabinet, which it must be quite something.
It's enormous. You can't quite. Your first Cabinet meeting is obviously a pinch yourself moment, but then in the first week as a Cabinet Minister, we had the death of Her Majesty, which meant the sort of accession council for the King, and then the audience of the King at Buckingham Palace that afternoon, and the funeral, and what an incredible honour. But being Min AF is pretty awesome. Being asked to be the voice of veterans in government is really quite humbling.
And Rachel Johnson is with us as well. I'm now thinking what I can ask you about sort of, but we know what you do. You do what I do.
I don't know what I do, Ian.
But your podcast, I keep praising it because I think
I'm so grateful,
because
obviously we're trying to reach more people.
You are a brilliant interviewer. You get things out of people that I'm not sure other interviewers would, and it's not because you're haranguing them. You're sort of teasing it out of them. And who's been your favourite guest so far on Difficult Women?
That's such a good question. Well, the premise of Difficult Women is nobody likes the title, really, because every single woman who comes and sits in the chair says, but I'm not difficult, I'm really easy. And I think, actually, don't ever say that, own it. What's wrong with being difficult? Only a woman would reject that. You only get somewhere if you're difficult. I just done.
As you've proved.
I'm not. You see, I'm going to do it myself. I'm not at all difficult. You asked me to come on Cross Question, and I said, of course, Ian.
Yes,
we like women. I don't know. I hate generalisations. I especially hate gendered generalisations. But women do like to please, and I think this doesn't actually do them any favours.
Women love to please me. That's always been the case.
But can I actually just say who I have done?
It doesn't work the other way around.
I have this week. The difficult woman was Alexandra Schulman, who edited Vogue for 25 years. And, she was a girl boss before people even said the word girl boss. She edited Gentleman's Quarterly that became GQ. It's now a huge success. And, she came on, and the first thing she said was, I don't think I'm at all difficult. Do you think, yes, maybe I'm occasionally grumpy, and I say what I think. And I just said, Alex, I've worked for you. Let's just agree. Anyway,
right.
Thanks for mentioning
it. I think we should go to another question. Let's go to Terry in Watford. Hello, Terry.
Hi, Ian. Can I just echo you on Rachel Johnson's Difficult Women? I love that podcast.
It's not just me, Rachel.
My shout-out one would be Tracy Crouch, learning, obviously, about her battle against cancer, but what she did for compulsive gamblers and standing up, I think it was to Philip Hammond.
Yes, it was.
Wonderful. And her and Matt Cousins from different sides of the political spectrum have really helped in combating compulsive gambling.
Right, let's get to your question, Terry.
Yeah, that's not my question. My question is, should the government bring forward the publishing of the OBR forecast? Discuss.
Well, Sam Coates, who was on the programme earlier, he's tweeted that Kwasi Kwarteng said he is going to bring it forward, but he doesn't actually say to when. James, I mean, outside your purview, I guess, this.
Yes.
Albie.
And the answer I had, you were completely just got torpedoed by your tweet from Sam Coates. So yes.
Well, Sam could be wrong. He very rarely is, but Albie.
Yes, I think it actually. Obviously, I think the mini budget should have been brought out with an OBR forecast in the first place. I think that was. I hope that was what Liz was alluding to when she said in her interview with Laura Kuenssberg that she hadn't laid the ground adequately. I would like to see that OBR forecast released as soon as possible.
Rachel?
But will it incorporate the U-turn, today's U-turn, or will it be based on last Friday's budget? Do you see what I mean? I mean, will they have already updated it? How long will that take? And will it make a material difference to their conclusions, would be my question.
It probably wouldn't necessarily.
Because it was only 2 billion. The lopping off of that. It sounds awful
when you say only 2 billion, but you're right.
I know,
it was.
But in the scheme of things, 2 billion is nothing. But it did manage to completely blot out the rest of this budget.
There is some interim statement coming this Friday, isn't there? I'm not quite sure what that means, an interim statement, how different that would be from the one ostensibly on November the 23rd. But I suppose whatever it is, it will either spook the markets or calm the markets, one or the other.
Well, I think the lesson has been learned. We've got to be very careful. We've got to make sure that when we say something, we say it having given it all proper consideration. We have discussed it appropriately, given that often stuff is market sensitive, and so you can't float it with the market beforehand. But I think the lesson of the last 2 weeks is that you have to prepare the ground, and when you say something you have to have all your numbers right. And so whether there's an interim statement this Friday or not, who knows, but it will need to be right. And when the statement comes on the 21st of November, it will definitely need to be absolutely 23rd. It will definitely need to be absolutely sort of laser-like in its accuracy.
Sarah says, Ian, I think Rachel should interview you. That isn't really how the podcast works, I don't think.
It is called Difficult Women, Sarah, although I'd love to have Ian on. I'd love to interview Ian at some point.
There you go. I don't think it's going to happen on that podcast. Right, let's go to another question. Thank you very much for your question, Terry. It's from Alan in Reigate. Alan, hi.
Good evening, Ian and panel.
Hi.
My question is quite simple. Does anybody believe in trickle-down economics?
Trickle-down economics. Do any of you believe in it? Albie?
I don't think the government believes in trickle-down economics. I think over time it has been an economic theory which has been limited in achieving its outcome. I think that cutting taxes, however, and streamlining regulation is a formula for growth, but we have to be cutting the right taxes. And I'm very clear that I thought that that cutting the 45p rate down to 40% was the wrong tax to be cutting.
Rachel?
I echo Joe Biden, who says trickle-down economics has not worked since the last Republic. Well, Reagan tried it, and his economic advisor resigned and said it was just a Trojan horse for delivering tax cuts to the rich.
James?
So I think depends on how you conceive trickle-down economics. But if you what you're setting out to do is to attract talent, the highest earners, the sort of the kind of global wealth creators to the UK, having a fiscal environment that is attractive to them is clearly valuable. Whether or not that is because their wealth trickles down directly in a supply chain to them personally, or whether it's through the way that they invest and are entrepreneurial and they create wealth within our communities, discuss. But I don't know that we should be apologising for a tax agenda that encourages the world's best to come here and to know that if they come here, they will be taxed in a way that's competitive with all the other major advanced economies.
Rachel.
I mean, James makes a really good point that 30% of tax in this country is generated by the 1% of tax of the highest taxpayers. Ergo, it does make fiscal sense to increase that pool, because then you will, it's huge leverage effect in terms of the revenues that come in from the treasury.
That was the argument for abolishing the cap on bankers' bonuses, wasn't it? Because it would
get
encourage
loads of
people from
in.
Paris and Frankfurt to come here, which...
and also you get the
logic
tax on those bonuses, which is at 45% now.
Thank you very much indeed.
I've never earned a bonus in my life, but I understand.
I have.
But but this is because you're a rock star.
Because of my audience figures.
But I understand
it was some time ago.
Well done, Iain. I'm not surprised.
But I'm led to believe by those who do understand these things that the current cap on bonuses has a slightly perverse effect on the behaviour of people, and so actually there's a sort of thing that people may behave in a more responsible way with bonuses go back to where they were, but that's just what I heard.
We are subbing Albie out for no other reason than he's going to this launch of his 2022 group, and Minette Batters will be joining us, president of the NFU, in a moment. Another difficult woman will be joining us.
She has done my podcast.
Well, I know she has. That's why I said it. Right, it's 8:31 on LBC. Time for the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Kwasi Kwarteng's tried to silence his critics just hours after announcing a U-turn on tax cuts for the highest earners. The Chancellor's told the Conservative conference the government is listening to feedback and is focused on delivering the major parts of the mini-budget. Well, meanwhile, it's understood this evening that Kwasi Kwarteng will bring forward his next financial statement from November. He'll set out his medium-term plan later this month, but an exact date hasn't yet been confirmed. And there's a warning: the UK faces a significant risk of gas shortages this winter due to the conflict in Ukraine. The regulator Ofgem says some big businesses could be forced to limit their usage to make sure there's enough left for homes. LBC weather: the south will be dry but cloudy tonight. Rain in northern England and southern Scotland with a low of 11 degrees. Rain easing across Wales and Northern Ireland tomorrow. Drier in the southeast. Some warm, bright spells as well with a high of 19 degrees.
LBC T's and C's apply. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:35 on LBC. Well, as I said, Albie has left us. Minette Batters, president of the NFU, joins us for your second appearance on Cross Question. You're very welcome. What do you hope to achieve by being at this conference?
Iain, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. It's all about influencing, it's all, sadly, about building relationships and getting what's needed for British agriculture over the line. So you've heard me banging on about food security for 9 years now. Prime Minister has committed to food security being a national priority. Well, that's, thank goodness, it's taken leaving the EU, a global pandemic and now a war in Ukraine to land that message, but it's landed. So it's about influencing. And I guess for me, it's about putting the solution forwards. This is what good looks like for farming, for food, for every single one of us. We're a huge marketplace here. So for me, I'm here to influence. We've got a stand here, tractor next door to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
James Heappey is here. Now, your constituency as well is presumably quite an agricultural constituency?
Yeah, very. Lots of small dairy.
We're talking about in Somerset as opposed to Norfolk.
Yes. Yeah, in Norfolk, they're massive farms. In Somerset, a couple of 100 acres, maybe 100 cows. That's
right.
About half of the course. And they are farms that unfortunately have been particularly struggling.
And we have Rachel Johnson with us as well. Right, let's take a text question from Jane, who says, in fact, the first two questions are on farming. How will wildlife and nature fare if the environmental land management scheme is abandoned? If it is to prioritise food production, should there be a ban on selling farmland that can be used for growing crops to commercial forestry businesses? I must declare an interest here, having a shareholding in a forestry machinery business. Minette, let's start with you.
We have never, ever changed our policy position. So we have been absolutely committed to delivering a scheme that works for food production and the environment and nature. And you separate them at your peril. So some people have been saying, well, actually, we need an environmental scheme and we need a separate scheme to deliver on the food strategy. You can't do that. We're dealing with a farmed landscape. We've got to deliver more from that landscape than we have ever done before. And for public investment, they want to see a multifaceted return. We've got huge requirements now on green energy. We've got massive pressures to keep producing the nation's food. And we want to do more for nature, and we have to do more for nature. So this is about, creating the right policy incentives, but don't separate them. We've never changed our position on this, and we will continue to engage with government to make sure that the scheme is fit for purpose and, most importantly of all, Iain, attracts over 70% of farmers to take part in it. That is absolutely key to Treasury funding it going forwards. If they don't see this scheme taken up at scale, farmers will walk away from it and government funding will walk away from it too, and we can't allow that to happen.
No, I know Rachel wants to quiz you on this.
Well, no, I think what Minette said makes perfect sense. This is the most important thing that we face as a country, the trio of pressures on our countryside, which are keep trying to protect nature, trying to create energy, and trying to feed our populations and trying to increase all our food and energy security. And Minette, as we've noted already, has done my podcast, and I do urge you to listen to it because she sets all of this out in much more detail. What worries me about this government's agenda, and obviously I'm not in the sector, Minette or Iain, is the fact that Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think it is proposing a bill which is going to flame and bonfire up to 1,500 EU regulations that are going to create a lot of these environmental protections, as well as a lot of other protections that we know about, on employment and so on. But it's the environmental protections that I feel we really can't afford to sunset those. These are the ones that are going
think is going to happen.
Yeah, well, we know that's going to happen. We absolutely know that's going to happen. What we were told in 2016 was that we would meet, if not exceed, standards when it comes to the environment and protections for farmers and so on and the consumer. What it turns out is in the rush for the dash for growth, those are going to be binned off in favour of GDP and of just growing the economy.
No one said that.
Well, hold on. It's all you hear is growth, and that is antithetical.
When is the rural economy unable to grow whilst also being sensitive to the environment and sensitive to farming. I think, it's such a sort of... No one has said that the rural environment and farming is going to be sacrificed on the altar of a sort of wider growth.
Well, what about these investment regions that you've mentioned already, or building huge amounts of, which we need, housing on, I don't know, protected landscape, things we do not know what is going to happen. I think it's going to be a Wild West.
Well, the investment zones, just to reassure you, Rachel, the investment zones very clearly are at the request of a local authority. If you don't want one, you don't get one. But if you've got land...
But you can be bribed. You could bribe a local authority, as you can bribe people in areas around fracking. You could say, you get your energy for free if you agree to fracking.
Well, I think that we have a right to develop jobs and an economy in rural areas, not just make it somewhere nice for people from the city to come and visit at weekends.
Minette, most sectors do not want to be over-regulated. And, I remember discussions with my father about this, about he was chuntering on about all these different EU regulations and would have dearly loved to be rid of them. Would you be arguing with Jacob Rees-Mogg about sort of keeping all of these regulations?
I would argue with Jacob Rees-Mogg about lots of things because it's so unclear. We are doing less checks than we have ever done on food imports from the EU. And Jacob Rees-Mogg talked about this ecosystem of trusted traders. We don't actually know what that looks like. So we're importing more than ever from the EU and we're not checking it. Now, you could say, well, we've got the same standards effectively at the moment. It doesn't matter. It does matter when we start looking at the rest of the world. And actually, it does matter with Europe, because if we had a food scare here, huge population, we need to be able to trace where that has come from, which is why those checks are so important. This current government is talking a lot about deregulation, and nobody quite knows. I've pushed Ranil Jaywanda on this. What actually do you mean? And nobody can answer that question. So I think that there is a real concern around how do we resolve the Northern Ireland Protocol? What does the Commission think of deregulating what we've got? Will we be able to access the EU market? That's pretty key for the people I represent. 500 million people on our doorstep. It's a very important market. So what does it mean for them? There's a lot of unanswered questions. It's easy, the rhetoric of deregulation. People love to hear that, but what does it actually mean and what are we deregulating?
Right, let's move on to Will in Mid-Devon. Will, hi, what's your question, please? Oh, it's a text question. I do apologise. Who should farmers and people employed in agriculture vote for at the next election? I'm a sheep farmer, and as International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss sold us out with the Australia trade deal, and I have no idea what Labour will do for our industry. James?
Well, obviously I'm going to say Conservative.
I was hoping for a newsline.
But I think that, I say this to my farmers all the time, that there's plenty with which that they will disagree. But fundamentally, when Labour are in charge, there is absolutely no interest in the countryside whatsoever.
My father always said he did better under a Labour government.
You see, I don't think we see that in Somerset.
He never voted for them, but
I don't think we see that in Somerset at all. And then the Lib Dems, we got Ed Davey, who apparently is going vegan and basically says whatever they need to say. I knocked on some swords in Tiverton and Honiton, where the Lib Dems have been before us. It was extraordinary, the things that the Lib Dems... Apparently they were going to reverse the red diesel stuff at one point, which is just complete nonsense. But they'll say whatever they need to say to be elected. And I think farmers have a pretty good radar for when they're not being told the truth. The people who really look after the countryside and the affairs of farmers is the Conservatives.
Or the National Farmers Union, Minette.
Well, that's a moot point in most NFU meetings.
Oh, controversial.
Bypass that one. Look, what I can say is I have never known farmers, they don't normally pass much comment on who they're going to vote for. They have often traditionally been Conservative voters, but you're right, many will say, well, actually, we did always do better under a Labour government. Look, the point being now for Will is it's who's got a plan that finally does stack up for the road that we're on. And, at the moment, I am really concerned about the alignment of DIT and DEFRA. We've, I believe, sold out on trade deals. Taking back control was about getting the best deal. We should be showing global leadership on animal welfare, on climate change, on really making other countries step up to where we are, not selling out on behalf of a service sector economy.
Do you think the Australian trade deal was a sellout?
Oh, it was a complete sellout because, Australia went through hell when we joined the common market back in 1973. Alexander Downer, who was High Commissioner at the time, he said to me 6 years ago, he said, Minette, and they're always very upfront, as you know, the Aussies, he said, you screwed us over when you joined the common market. We've been through hell and we're coming back to get you. And they've got us. They never expected to get what they got. We should have held out. The lesson is, Iain, don't put dates in the diary on trade deals. And I really worry with the Indian trade deal and Diwali. If we put that date in the diary, the Indians will have us over a barrel.
Remind us who negotiated that Australian trade deal.
Well, that was Liz Truss.
Exactly. Rachel.
Well, we're out of the single market now. Would it be better for farming if we went back in?
Do you know what? I think we can do it all. I think we can have international trading relationships, but I think we can show leadership whereby we are maintaining our high standards, which does allow us access to the European market. There's a way of doing this that really does work for this country. It's just been elusive to date.
Right, we'll take more of your calls and texts in just a moment on Cross Question. It's 8:46.
This is LB.
In cinemas Friday.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:49 here on LBC. James Heappey is with us, Minette Batters from the NFU, and Rachel Johnson as well. Let's go to Jonathan in Finchley. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, good evening. Here's my question. Is it fair that the energy support package should support even the more wealthy amongst us?
Minette.
No. I just think, we've got a massive debt. We've got to be very careful about how we prioritise the funding. My focus would be actually on making things like agriculture and horticulture vulnerable sectors, because this isn't going to end in 6 months' time on food. We've got to make sure that food stays affordable, but most importantly, Iain, we've got to make sure that farmers and growers keep producing it. I mean, if you look at the growers, we're seeing the lowest level of production since records began in 1985. That's tomatoes, cucumbers, because energy costs are so high and they haven't got access to people to come and pick them. So we've got to focus on individual sectors as to how we drive inflation down to give everybody the confidence to make these big investments in producing food and to keep it affordable. So I think it needs a much more forensic approach to how we deal with the cost of living crisis. There are many people out there that do not need this package, and I've had a lot of people up here today saying, we don't need it. I don't need that package. We should prioritise the poor, and we should make sure that we look at affordability and which sectors need to be vulnerable sectors.
I suppose the argument would go, well, that's fine, people would agree with that, but it's much cheaper to roll out a scheme where everybody gets something rather than have some sort of means testing, because that would be an incredibly bureaucratic way to approach it.
60 billion doesn't sound like it's cheap to me. I mean, it's a huge debt that we are going to have on the back of this, and I don't believe 6 months, as I say, for the food sector, it's not going to do it.
Okay, James?
I mean, you'd have made exactly the same arguments around furlough and various other interventions. If you want to do something at pace, and rewind 3 weeks, it feels like a lifetime ago already, but before, in the run-up to the end of the leadership election, the media and the public rightly were impatient over what the government intervention would be, and they wanted it delivered quickly. You can't deliver something quickly if you're going to do means testing and everything else. So a universal thing, which the £400 per household is, and then bear in mind that the cap per kilowatt hour of consumption, whilst it's a generalisation to say that wealthier people have bigger houses and bigger energy needs, that will broadly be the case. And so, the reduction from 6,000 to 2,500 per year is for the average family, but those with bigger houses or bigger energy consumption needs will still be spending more.
Rachel?
I sort of agree with what everybody said. I think if you were going to do something so big at pace, it was going to be hard to means test it. Having said that, there was another way of doing it completely, which would have been to, uplift universal, credit, something like that. And also to do a package for small businesses and institutions that rely heavily on energy for their actual business. So we don't see, the high street turn into a wasteland because pubs are having to close and fish and chip shops are having to close because they can't meet their energy bills. So I think we could have been more targeted towards those in most need and business. And also, as Minette says, the farmers who also rely hugely on energy.
So there is an intervention for businesses. I mean, it's worth, there was the domestic intervention and a business intervention, and then there was some other discretionary stuff which matters enormously to constituents in Wales, for example, where they are off-gas grid energy consumers, and so you need to do something for people who use oil boilers as well.
Jonathan, what would you do?
Well, I would, very simple. I'd say the first average, what's the average kilowatt hours per year? 3,000, 4,000, whatever. The first X kilowatt hours would be subsidised, and everything else you're on your own. I've got a friend who uses 50,000 kilowatt hours for his pool, and the taxpayer, if he keeps the pool on, the taxpayer will pay 20 grand towards keeping his pool warm the whole year. It's ridiculous. That's not means tested. It's simple.
So, I mean, obviously, where you get anomalous things like that, like people heating their swimming pool at taxpayers' expense, it's pretty grim. But there are plenty of very low margin, energy-intensive businesses in agriculture, I suspect, particularly, where actually you do need to kind of have a fairly unlimited commitment to the intervention, because otherwise people are going out of business. And if they're going out of business in the food industry, I agree completely with Minette that what Ukraine has exposed very vividly is that energy security, food security and supply chain security matter enormously in order to make you sovereign.
Well, can I just say I have drained my hot tub.
You man of the people.
We're taking out our violin.
Right, on that bombshell, let's go to a text question from Kevin in Hull. A rising number of people in our armed forces are being referred to the PREVENT programme for showing signs of far-right radicalisation. Why is this happening? Now, obviously, that's clearly aimed more at James.
Yeah, it's not something I'm aware of, if I'm honest. I mean, I think that there are definitely people within the armed forces who have been tempted by that sort of thing on a number of occasions in the past. I can't say that it's come across my desk that it is something that is noticeably on the rise right now, but I would go away and look at that with some urgency.
I mean, I have to say, from memory, from various reports that I've read, that there is evidence of this happening. I'm slightly surprised that you don't know about it.
Yeah, well, me too, if that's really a thing.
Okay. Rachel, any comment?
This is not my area of expertise, and if James hasn't heard of it, I certainly haven't, I'm afraid.
And I suspect that will be Minette's answer as well.
It certainly is, Ian.
Right. Thank you, Kevin, for that. You flummoxed us all. Manish is in Battersea and says, what does the panel make of the idea of Rishi Sunak replacing Liz Truss as PM? Would that solve this economic crisis? Well, I'm not sure how that would come about. You can't just sort of insert somebody. That's what the Italian governments do, isn't it? So they appoint people who aren't elected.
Yeah. I mean, look, we've just had a leadership election. And yes, that was an internal thing within the Conservative Party, but those are the rules of the game, right? That's how all parties elect their leader. And
do you think it's time for those rules to be changed, though? But perhaps not if the party's in opposition, but if the party's in government, maybe there should be a different way of doing it.
Well, I don't know, because I suspect that the consequence of that would be that the parliamentary party may not act as swiftly as it has done. Some people might say that's a great thing, the Whip's office particularly. But we are a parliamentary democracy, and to move to a place where we're effectively having direct public referenda on a change of leader for the incumbent government, that's no longer a parliamentary democracy. That's effectively a direct mandate.
Minette?
I think the point that James makes is exactly what went wrong. We are a parliamentary democracy. Our MPs are elected by their constituencies, and they should be able to have the say on behalf of those constituents in this sort of situation. You know, my children are 18 now. They are saying to me, so how come less than 200,000 people could decide on a new Prime Minister with a different mandate? That's pretty difficult to justify. So I think the model is wrong. I think you've got to go.
So you think the 370 people should do that, do you?
Well, they're elected by their constituents, so there's not a perfect model. But if you're going to look at parliamentary democracy, you've got to empower Parliament to be able to make that decision. When you go to a very small group of the membership that is not a true demographic of the people of this country, you know, she's inherited a massive mandate, and it's a very different government. And I think, you know, there are questions going to be asked about, is it democracy working as best it can?
Rachel?
I think all the bets are off. I think that if the party decides that it wants a change of leader, the party will have a change of leader. It will affect a change of leader. I mean, we also have a tradition of, rather than an X number of letters going in, of the men in grey suits going and just saying the game's up. You don't have to have a formal process, as I understand it, necessarily. You know, the 22 committee can always change the rules of the 22 committee.
Yeah. James?
I just think, as it's party conference season, in defence of political parties, our public discourse benefits from having groups of activists around a sort of common ideological cause. And, you know, the balance that the major political parties have struck between empowering parliamentarians to cause the vote of no confidence and to have a say in the initial stages of the leadership election, but to engage our party memberships thereafter, is probably the right balance. Because, you know, these people who pay their 25 quid a year to be a member of the Conservative Party and come to a conference, they do so to participate in exactly this sort of moment. And our democracy is better for having them and Labour members and Lib Dem members and Green members all paying their money and being part of the political process.
Right, we have a final text question from Jane in Liverpool. After the Prime Minister and Chancellor's U-turn this morning, what is your most embarrassing U-turn? It's a good question, isn't it? I'm trying to think of one to enable you to think of one yourselves. But I'm sure, Corey, can you think of a U-turn I've done over the years in policy terms? Oh gosh. No, you can't. Useless. Minette, can you think of a U-turn?
I can think of my home life and running my business and trying to referee my children. I can think of many U-turns that I have done. In this role, I feel like I've been absolutely resolute and on a journey, and U-turns are not part of the game plan at all. So yeah, I can think of them elsewhere, but not in the role of being NFU president.
James?
I'm going to go literally rather than metaphorically. When I first commissioned, I was part of on public ceremonial duties in London, and when we were doing the guard outside Buckingham Palace, I was facing my troops, and I said left turn forward march. And obviously, I turned left and they turned left and we marched off in opposite directions, which meant a very literal U-turn as I had to scamper Scarpa to catch up with my guys.
So were you in one of those bearskin things?
No, I wasn't quite that smart. I was a good old line infantry regiment.
That's a good U-turn though, we'll let you have that one. Rachel?
No, I can see the clock. I've timed out.
No, you haven't.
All right.
Listen, I'm in charge of this programme, not you.
I thought I was going to get away with it. Well, I suppose that in days of, I don't know, people used to shout at me when I had to come to Tory party conference for work, but I thought you were a Lib Dem, and I was always made to feel that I had U-turned away from being a Lib Dem, and I couldn't even show my face at Tory party conference.
So just remind us.
But I am no longer a member of the Lib Dems.
How did you vote at the last election?
Blessed sponge, I remind you of amnesia. Right? The whole event and that whole election clean from my memory.
Okay.
It was a great election.
I believe you, thousands wouldn't. Right, Minette, thank you very much. James, Rachel, thank you too. We'll be back with another cross question tomorrow at 8 o'clock. If you've missed an episode, you can catch up on Global Player, or there is a cross question podcast if you just want the audio as well. Rachel's already leaving and we haven't even quite finished yet, but thank you very much for being with us. In a moment, we're going to talk about drugs policy because a group of Conservative police commissioners is calling for cannabis to be reclassified from a Class B drug, wait for it, to a Class A drug. Now that's sort of slightly counterintuitive in the drugs debate, so we'll hear from a Conservative police commissioner who's at the conference and we'll get your views as well on whether it should be reclassified or maybe you think it should be completely declassified. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.